We're going to stay with the banking theme, and we thought it would be useful to bring one of the 15 largest banks in the world to the stage to hear from the bank which really has been the leader in the financing of municipalities around the world, but especially here in the United States, because we're talking often about how U.S. cities grapple with these challenges, but how we can do this on a global scale. So Chris Hamel is here. He's the Managing Director and the Head of Municipal Finance Group at RBC Capital Markets, based in New York City. Fifth largest bank in the USA. You may know it originally as Royal Bank of Canada. 70 offices, 15 countries, 26 cities here in the US, including LA and San Francisco. I think Richmond is a client, and they've been very engaged in not just the revitalization of cities like this, but the build out and development of cities all over the world. They not only focus on the municipal finance side, but we're going to hear about P3s. What happens when public-private partnerships and municipal finance, as we traditionally know it, come together and converge? And that's what our theme is today. Chris Hamel, Municipal Financing. Thanks so much, Chris.
Really appreciate it. I'm not sure how I feel at this particular moment after Christine, as a Vancouver resident, suggested that the Royal Bank of Canada may not be essential to the financial system of Canada. But with that said, I appreciate Gordon's introduction. You know, I might add that Gordon told me there are not a lot of bankers here today, which I think speaks to the high quality of the audience. Inevitably, when I'm introduced as being part of the Royal Bank of Canada, people assume that I'm Canadian. I am not Canadian. I'm an American, but I do speak Canadian. So my presentation today is really a collection of observations that stem from our work as a global infrastructure investment bank. We're active on a variety of continents in terms of P3 activity, including the United States. And then in the United States, which I'll talk about today, the principal form of infrastructure finances is the municipal market, which is my own expertise. I might add that I think we're at an interesting inflection point as the US enters a presidential election season. And every day, our company and my department wakes up with the purpose of helping our clients build better communities. And my speech here today, my presentation, is really an opportunity to test ideas on smart and informed people who come from a lot of disciplines. So I look forward to the opportunity to getting your feedback later today. Before I launch into the solution side of infrastructure in the United States, let me kind of summarize what I think you all know about infrastructure in the United States, which is that there's a tremendous funding gap that we face, that we've never invested less in infrastructure in the United States, that our grade is unacceptable, and that with candor, virtually every week from somewhere in the United States, there's anecdotal evidence of really the tragedy of this underinvestment through the years. It's my view, and I'll talk about this at length, that the core need, and this may be obvious, is additional funding. And what I'll talk about in my presentation is how we can do more with existing funding, and how we need to find ways to increase the funding. And one of the things I want to point out, there's a debate in our country. Actually, it came up in talking with someone at lunch today, is there's a view that what we need is more capital as opposed to more funding. And you should know I reject that notion. There's plenty of capital available to fund American infrastructure. The question is, how do you pay it back? Thank you. Let me talk a little bit about how infrastructure is funded now in the United States. 77% of it is funded with state and local government. That's principally through the municipal bond market, which is my own expertise. Let me describe the municipal market. It's a $3.7 trillion market. That's debt that belongs to state and local government through the United States that's been used to fund infrastructure through the years. That's the amount of outstanding debt. That the truly unique characteristic of this debt is that the interest on it is exempt from federal and state income taxes, and so thus investors are willing to take a lower interest rate. It's the lowest interest rate available to anyone financing infrastructure, including the United States Treasury. A powerful, powerful tool, which is part of what the analysis needs to be as to how we move forward. And then, frankly, it's a highly decentralized system. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In Canada, the mother country of my bank, there's about a country that is about the same size as California in terms of population and economic size. There's about 80 local issuers of debt who finance infrastructure. In the state of California, there are nearly 4,000. So nationally, the infrastructure responsibility falls to about 50,000 issuers, 8,000 to 12,000 of which come to market every year. An emerging model in many Western economies, Europe, Canada, Australia, is public-private partnerships, P3. And I would tell you that it is the policy of the Washington policy elite to advance P3 in this country. That for more than a decade, they've been committed in a bipartisan fashion, including the think tank crowd, to advance P3 in this country. My own personal belief, and I'm going to talk about why that hasn't happened, is that there's a broad misunderstanding of what P3 is. P3 really is like six blind men describing an elephant. It means different things to different people. It can be narrowly interpreted to be just about design build, or it can be much more broadly interpreted to talk about design build, finance, operate, and maintain. And my own view of the world is that we're going to have to deconstruct that model if it's going to have any significant effect in the United States. This chart really describes in broad stroke how P3 works. And in essence, whether it's interpreted narrowly or interpreted broadly, that it really is captured by a legal agreement between a governmental entity and a private sector company that documents the responsibilities, the risks and rewards of advancing a piece of infrastructure. This model has only been accepted in the United States at about the 1% level. So in the last 25 years, only 1% of the infrastructure spend comes from this technique, and in fact, half of that has come in the last 5 years. So for me, the interesting question is, given the top-down push by Washington on P3 in the United States, why hasn't it occurred? And that's the question I'd like to answer now. It has a lot to do with the municipal market. Let me encapsulate this slide with a very simple statement. If there was no municipal market in the United States, P3 would be broadly adopted. But the components of the municipal market really prevent, to date, the widespread penetration of P3 in the United States. Recall my observation. State and local government has the ability to finance infrastructure at the lowest cost in the marketplace. Recall my observation about the decentralized nature of American politics. We love local government. Said another way, if you're building an infrastructure project in Australia, you're going to go to Sydney. But if you're building an infrastructure project in Richmond, California, you're sure it's not going to go to Washington, D.C. You're not going to go to Sacramento. Actually, you're really going to go to the office of Mayor Butt, who was here yesterday to tee up this conference. That's the way this world works. And with candor, I think the global infrastructure players really don't understand that. That then leads across the United States to a varying legal authorization where it's really a patchwork from the states down, 50 different states, hundreds of cities that each have their own view of what P3 is and how it'll be implemented. And then frankly, I think this is less so today, but among public officials, there is really a misconception that if the private sector provides this infrastructure, for somehow it's free and they'll take care of it. That's really not the way it works. If the private sector is involved in something, they want a fair rate of return. So my own view, and I think the facts that I described kind of scream for this conclusion, that the US will develop its own form of P3 that'll be some kind of hybrid between the municipal market and P3 as we know it around the world. And a little bit about what the balance of my presentation is what the kind of, the sort of dimensions of that convergence might be, which I think will occur in a 3 to 5 year period. First and foremost is a focus on design build. At the heart of P3 is the design build concept, which is really a procurement method for letting construction contracts. And I think it's been documented that it really is a way to fund infrastructure on a less expensive way. This study, which has been passed around this room, was paid for by my firm because, frankly, the New York legislature won't approve broad design build authorization for state and city government to use it in New York. So we paid for this study to document the savings that are achieved. I'll just cite one example. The signature infrastructure project right now in New York City is the construction of the new Tappan Zee Bridge. When it was first conceived, the estimated cost was $5 billion. Because of design build, the actual contract came in more than 20% more, saving $1.1 billion. So I think design build is an incredibly powerful example for state and local government to apply to their procurement process. Secondly, I think what you're going to see in the coming years is the best of both worlds, the best of the P3 market and the best of the muni market. If design build is a cheaper way to construct infrastructure, clearly tax-exempt financing is the least costly way to finance it. A true United States success story with respect to P3 is privatized university housing. This involves the use of the P3 method, so the private sector provided housing, versus combined with tax-exempt financing, because for an interesting quirk in federal law, the private sector is allowed to use tax-exempt financing to do housing. And since 2010, over 100 universities in the United States have done P3 projects to produce 64,000 additional dorm beds across the country. Really a tremendous success story, and in my view, a very good example or model, if you will, for policymakers to follow in terms of other sectors. Finally, I think there's going to be a discussion of the monetization of non-core assets. Really, the public sector taking a look at their balance sheets and saying, what do we own and is it necessary to our core mission? I'm reminded of this kind of approach when I read this Wall Street Journal article about Macy's and their iconic store at Herald Square. They're actually thinking of selling it. Why is it? Why are they doing that? Because they're really not a real estate company. They're a retail company. Do they really need to own their store on 34th Street to execute their mission? Or is it better for them to lease that space and apply the revenues that they got from the sale of the building to their core mission? I'll give you one example of that has already occurred this year in the public sector. CPS Energy is the public power entity in San Antonio that provides electrical service to the residents of that area. They had a bunch of cell phone towers on their right-of-way, and what they did was bundle those up and sell them to the private sector this year, making more than $40 million, which they in turn applied to the infrastructure related to their core mission. So I think you're going to see the public sector take a different look at what their balance sheet is. I think this discussion suggests two broader policy questions, which I'll conclude on this note. The first is this public-private question. What is our society comfortable with? And I think that answer is going to get answered in different ways in different states and different communities. For example, primarily in the United States, water service is a public function. Are we comfortable with the private sector being responsible for that function? Over the last 20 years, there's been emergence of the private sector in providing correctional services. Is that something we're comfortable with? Personally, and my daughters would agree with this, I think internet service is critical to the conducting of a society. That is a form of public infrastructure. But obviously, we're all comfortable that the private sector is in charge of that. And so I think that's going to be a debate as we enter down this path that we go through. And then frankly, that's going to lead to funding questions. A traditional funding method for a governmental entity, if they want to build more infrastructure, is to raise tolls. Do you want to pay for infrastructure with higher tolls, or are you comfortable with a private sector solution? Do you sell the naming rights on public infrastructure and raise money that way, which is traditionally what the private sector would do? And I think there's going to be a good debate that we all kind of weigh in on about how we're going to raise money in various communities. And frankly, as an investment banker, I'm agnostic. What I need is a revenue source to raise money. I don't really care where the revenue comes from, but I think that's part of the political process. The final point I'd like to make in terms of broader policy question is this whole discussion of the disruption of the old economy by technological innovation, which I'm not a technology guy, I'm a muni banker, but I enjoy many of the benefits of that disruption. The problem is, or the challenge is that the revenue sources of state and local government are really part of the old economy. And as you create a new economy, state and local government are going to have to figure out how do you replace the revenue sources. I'll give you one example. I was in Phoenix within the last 3 weeks, and I think appropriately so. The Phoenix airport is negotiating with Uber and Lyft to allow them to operate to pick up passengers landing at the airport. I think a great idea. However, 86% of the transportation revenues related to the Phoenix airport come from the medallion system that exists at that airport with respect to the taxi service. So how do they, on one hand, probably appropriately innovate and provide a better level of service that Uber and Lyft represent without disrupting a core revenue source of that airport? I think that is a big policy question that the country will have to face at every level of government as the new economy is created. I'll conclude on this note. The last 30 days, I've been reading a book called The Silo Effect, and it's by the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, the editor-in-chief in the United States of the Financial Times. And it's her premise that the financial crisis was really created by people operating in a silo, in many cases investment bankers, far too narrowly focused on their product and their business and their concern, not thinking much broader beyond that in terms of their own company, much less the entire economy. And that what we have to do a better job of is thinking outside our silos. That's something I've heard at every social event the last 2 days that I've been at, and it's why I'm pleased to be here making this presentation. I think the solution to infrastructure in the United States is going to come from an audience like this, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my views on it. Thank you.